All right, let's go ahead and get started. Last class. Don't forget, the final is a week from today at 10 o'clock. So make sure to be looking over the study guide, contacting me if you have any questions, especially as you prepare for the comprehensive part. So don't forget that is coming up. We're focusing. Any of you want to just kind of run some ideas by me, or if I talk about these things, cannot read. All right, so make sure that you get in contact with me with any questions. I'll be around through the rest of this week. Certainly, you can catch me by email as well. We do have a couple of things to finish up with this class. I want to predominantly just briefly survey some things going on in the 21st century. We're only 15 years into it, so there's not much to say at this point. But there are a couple of important shifts occurring, not only in Christianity, but within Western culture, and some other things that are having a profound effect on Christianity. One of the first things, especially in Western culture, is a change in how people view the world. And this applies to Christians as well as to those that might be of other religions or of no religion. So right around the world, a lot of the world view through the 18th and 19th centuries, one is often referred to as modernism. Essentially, modernism was an approach to the world where human beings it's kind of believed that human beings are able to shape and create their own worlds, that there's a lot of optimism of what human beings are able to do, coming off of the Enlightenment and thinking about culture being progressive and positive. But as modernism developed, there were some things that came with it. And so we increasingly see Western culture especially becoming more secular. There's this notion of separation from God. God's separated from the world, and there's not that need to appeal to the supernatural. Now, certainly people are religious in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, even in today, but as we think about the broad overview of Christianity we've been looking at, culture has gradually become post-Christian. It's not in some places anti-Christian. But then also we think about the development of modern nation states, separating church from government. Now, in some ways that's good. In other ways that's taken us in some directions that might not have been where they were intended. But largely the modernist worldview was one that said God should be separate from the public sphere. Also with modernism, a lot of people became more naturalistic. Now again, modernism coming out of the Enlightenment, the rise of science, the rise of different views of economics, other things like that. And a lot of the people that kind of started us on this trend weren't necessarily anti-Christian, weren't necessarily totally naturalistic, but now we live in a world where for a lot of people, this world, nature, is all that there is. And so the modernist view tended to emphasize those aspects. It also tended to emphasize the abilities of humans, the sanctity of humans, the dignity of human life. And modernism also tended to be rather optimistic about what human beings could achieve. And so when you think about the 19th century and the 20th century, you see a lot of people thinking about human beings can solve the world's problems. We can end diseases. We can We can bring about justice and peace. But in the latter part of the 20th century, that last quarter century or so, a lot of that optimism began to change. And there are a couple of things that people point to as precipitating that change, that decline of that optimism about what human beings can achieve. One is the increased presence of poverty. Modernism kind of promised economically that everyone's position would get better. That as society evolved, it was progressive, so even the poorest of the poor would be doing very well. Well, certainly by the end of the 20th century, some people had done really well, but modernism didn't better everyone's condition. And so we talk today about a huge wealth gap, not only within countries, but in comparison to countries. And so modernism didn't solve that problem. We also see that modernism kind of often didn't care for the environment. And so we live as human beings with this idea of we can consume the resources that exist in our environment, which often led to environmental problems. And so the pollution of waters, the effect on wildlife. And so today we, of course, even this morning, the President spoke from Paris, a conference about climate change. And while there's a lot of argument about climate change and what kind of effect human beings have on climate change and what kind of impact this will have, we do have to recognize that there are ways in which we've not cared about the environment, and we've seen some of the consequences of that. The proliferation of weapons in the latter part of the 20th century, from post-World War II period on, also caused a lot of people discouragement. Huge amounts of money out of national budgets were spent on development of weapons, development of very deadly weapons, and throughout the latter part of the 20th century, through most of that, the United States and the Soviet Union especially were engaged in a Cold War. Right? They were actually firing on each other, but it was this proliferation, this stockpiling of nuclear weapons, with the assumption being of mutually assured destruction. Once one nation fires a nuclear weapon on some other nation, well, that nation's going to respond in kind, and so everybody's going to end up dying because of this proliferation. So the types of weapons being developed, the amount of weapons being developed, and the amount of money spent on weapons also led to a more pessimistic outlook on human beings. Modernism didn't help us psychologically. Instead, it was the reverse. A lot of the secular promises, the naturalistic promises, the failure of religion to address some of those issues led to the rise of depression, increase in the feelings of stress, development of eating issues. All of these kinds of psychological problems, which are real and have real effects, but they were proliferated as well toward the end of the 20th century. The rise of crime, unemployment, the breakdown of the family, the continued presence of racism, the wealth gap, as we've already talked about, all of those things continue to develop in the latter part of the 20th century, leading people to be discouraged, pessimistic about the modernist outlook and what modernism could tell us about who we are. Furthermore, around the same time, we also see an increase in globalization. Globalization refers to the developing interdependence of cultures upon each other. We live in a time and in a society where we cannot, and really no country can, exist independently of other countries. A lot of our economic and our political and other aspects of culture are intertwined with the activities of other nations and other countries. Right now, in fact, predominantly a lot of people have some sort of electronic device in front of them. those components were not made in the United States. Right? They were developed by other countries. They were developed in other places and shipped to the United States. Right? So a lot of our technology, a lot of our other aspects that we have bring us closer together. Right? And so we have this way in which technology both is responsible for globalization, but also helps globalize the world. And so it's kind of participating in and causing at the same time. The fact that we can contact people in relatively brief amount of times across the globe, where in previous generations it would take weeks, if not months, to correspond with somebody half the world away. And we can do so immediately through Skype or through other types of messaging type of software. The amount of information that we can know about other places and other peoples. Right? Technology allows us to, if we want to, learn about what's going on in other places in the world. And so we become closer to these people, closer to these countries as we are able to know them and integrate with them. Dr. Warren, for example, teaches several Bible studies with people in China through Skype. And so, there's a lot of positives in which this globalization and technology work. But, one of the things we have to recognize is we're coming closer together as a world. Economics, of course, also brings us closer together. Just a couple of years ago, of course, was the Great Recession, where there was a global economic downturn. And a lot of it was based on what happened in just a few countries to start that then had an impact on other countries, because countries are so interrelated economically, which is why this past summer there was such a concern that Greece was going to default on its loans to the European Union, because if they did that, that would have an effect on Europe, that would have an effect on the United States, that would have an effect on Asia. And so economically, we are tied to other countries. When it comes to media, of course, media ties us to other countries, but is always, in a sense, in the modern age, tied us to other countries. Of course, Hollywood films have been going overseas for decades, but now we're starting to see cinema from other countries, other nations, starting to come over here as well. Of course, with YouTube, other file sharing sites like that, you can watch people, individuals, groups from other countries. I mean, think of Gangnam Style, right? This Korean song about a Korean fashion district, and the style of the Korean fashion district, how this becomes a worldwide phenomenon, right? I mean, 20 years ago, of course, that doesn't happen. But because of the media, we have those kind of things. So we have a decline in the optimism of modernity. The promises of science, the promises of secularity, the promises of human power, plus we have this increased interdependence and connections with each other, have precipitated what we might call the development of postmodernism or postmodernity. Modernism emphasized the powers of the human reason and was looking for universals in the human experience. But with the breakdown of modernism, with the rise of globalism, a lot of people started questioning how important that impact was, or how useful that was. And so within a postmodern world, and as people have adopted a postmodern outlook, a lot of them are beginning to reject the idea of grand narratives. Now, what's a grand narrative? Well, grand narrative refers to a story that binds a culture or a group of people together. A story that has explanatory power for how society works, why it's shaped in the ways it's shaped. Excuse me. Just briefly, the grand narrative of Christianity would be something like this. In the beginning, God created human beings. But human beings fell into sin, and so God gradually developed a plan that would bring and redeem human beings back to Him through the death of Jesus. And so after the death of Jesus, we have the opportunity for forgiveness of those sins as we look for the coming of Jesus and the end of time. Right now, of course, that's a very brief overview. But essentially, when you think about it, that narrative provides a lot of the explanation for how Christians view the world. Right? When we look at the world around us, when we think about our interactions with human beings, that grand narrative shapes a lot of how we talk and think about those kind of issues. Well, of course, other cultures, other religions have their own grand narratives about how the world works. Not just creation narratives, but something larger that explains authority, explains relationships between individuals. Well, one of the things that, of course, a lot of people began to ask as they came into contact with other grand narratives is, well, how could any of these be true? And so some people began to reject the idea that there is a grand narrative that explains how the world works. The postmodern view also began to claim that it's very difficult to know reality. That when we attempt to look at the world around us, we always come from a position that's been conditioned. It's been conditioned by our ethnic background, our class background, it's been conditioned by our gender, it's been conditioned by any sort of religious background we have, and so we can't get to reality as it really is, we can only get to reality as we are conditioned, is the postmodern outlook. Now certainly I would say, yeah, a lot of that does affect us, but I think there's a way to get to some realities, but yeah, a lot of our background, our personality of who we are and what we participate in does end up shaping us. And we have to recognize that and come to a way to get around some of those things. But if you can't know reality, it leads you to the position that there's a lack of objective knowledge. For the postmodern, it's very difficult to talk about what we might say capital T truth. Right? What is truly true. Instead, we can talk about little t truths. Right? This is true for you, or this is true for me. But there is no, or there are very few capital T truths to the postmodern. Instead, the postmodern outlook is very skeptical about any claims to the universality of grand narratives, the ability of human beings to know reality, and the claim of objective knowledge. A lot of people shaped by postmodernism will question those things, immediately kind of be suspicious once people start to talk about those ideas. So if there is no ultimate grand narrative for everyone, if it's difficult to know reality, if it's almost impossible to have objective knowledge, then, well, we should accept and promote diversity. Recognize that there are different forms of expression.